It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Society's president, Professor James Raven. James has built a highly distinguished career. He is currently a Life Fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge, an Honorary Fellow and Emeritus Professor of Modern History at the University of Essex. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, and his numerous fellowships give some indication of the breadth and depth of his activity and interests. They include the British Academy, the Society of Antiquaries, the Linnaean Society, the Royal Historical Society, and he's a member of the Royal Literary Society and the American Antiquarian Society. His work covers bibliographical and book history studies, literary, social, cultural history, and cultural studies. Many in this audience will have heard his Panizzi lectures in 2010 on London book sites, places of printing and publication before 1800, subsequently published as Bookscape, Geographies of Printing and Publishing in London before 1800, and we will have read and cited his works such as Publishing Business in 18th Century England and The Business of Books, Booksellers and the English Book Trade, 1450 to 1850, among others. James's accomplishments are many, but I would also like to highlight his service to the Bibliographical Society. He has been an active member of council, served on all its various subcommittees, and the Society has benefited especially from his leadership on our Fellowships and Bursaries program and monitoring and taking action on libraries at risk. He has been a vocal champion of the Society, and quite a few new members have joined the Society due to his advocacy. So I invite Professor Raven now to give his presidential address, Monsters, Myths, and Methods towards a global book biography of Erik Pontoppidan's The Natural History of Norway, 1755. James.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Meg, very much for that very generous introduction. And as I said, it's a delight to actually give this in person. And I also want to thank a large number of people for the remarkable help that they've given BibSoc members and other colleagues in different parts in recent years in libraries and archives quite far from here. I've so far examined about 80 copies of the editions of my subject, and generous colleagues in more distant parts have examined about 50 more. I think it would be invidious to single out individuals. You will know who you are, and your assistance will, of course, be fully acknowledged in the publication. It's probably going to be a book, in fact, that will follow. This is actually a story about monsters, myths, and methods, bibliographical methods relating material forms to the circulation and influence of ideas. And for this evening, ideas, as we shall see, specifically about beasts, both fabulous and exaggerated. My broader objective is to explore what we might gain from a book biography or a life cycle of a book. How, by concentration on a single title, we might chart the history of an individual work from its genesis, publication, circulation, and reception in different forms and in different places across generations of use and conservation. A few such projects have, of course, been attempted and in different ways, and I'm showing three outstanding but very different ones. Ultimately, I'd suggest the test of the approaches remains in the quality of the bibliographical scholarship, of an intimate understanding of subtle changes between successive editions, in typography and format, in paratextual developments, in the nuances of different translations, in different accompanying illustrations, and in the variations of emphasis in public reviews, and of course, of individual readings. So, I'm going to give it a go. In late 1748, Erik Pontoppidan, Danish intellectual and newly installed Bishop of Bergen, and I've got, I think, another familiar print of him and his gravestone, his tomb, which I rediscovered really in the German church, hidden away from public view in the courtyard of the German church in Copenhagen. He began collecting materials for his natural history of Norway. He published the finished work in two parts as Det første Forsøg på Norges naturlige Historie, the first volume printed in Copenhagen in 1752, and the second in 1753. A year later, the history, modestly titled in the original A First Attempt, was translated into German as Versuch einer natürlichen Geschichte Norwegians, and published again in Copenhagen and again in two parts, separate volumes in 1753 and 1754. A year after that, the two parts of the work were translated into English and published together in a grand folio volume in London as a less tentatively titled The Natural History of Norway. A modest but very elegantly printed German edition of 1769 only republished the first part of the story, although the publications of the 1790s spawned numerous later extracts, commentaries, and references, as we shall see in a while. It was, however, the three original editions of together 1752 to 1755, here they are together, that forged the reputation of the story, with no further later edition of the full work. The Danish is in quarto, German in octavo, and there's the English folio. The size of the format of these richly illustrated editions, as we can see, was very different, as is the typography and design. The first Danish quarto edition boasts neat, well-executed printing, very largely in black letter, although on variable paper, with some print on the poorest, often showing through the page. The effect of different typefaces can also prove distracting, at least to the modern eye, with some footnotes when in Latin in Roman, with titles in Roman italics, but others also in small black letter, using asterisks, double asterisks, and asterisms to mark the notes. And I'll return to the printing a little bit later. The different printed editions were also famously illustrated, with copperplate engravings, printed, of course, separately, and inserted between the other printed pages. I'll give you just some examples. There's the animals. They were often of different styles as well. These sort of individual, almost sort of small vignettes. Others were large, almost panoramas here of Danish costume, of Norwegian costume. How readers physically viewed the images varied according to the format of the editions. The pages of engravings were tipped in and folded as pull-out pages for the Danish and German editions. There you've got a comparison of the two. And the same images were further copied and recut in London, but with this map of Norway inserted at the beginning before the title page. Born in Aarhus, Denmark in 1698, Erik Pontoppidan, in service as a tutor, made his first visit to Norway in 1719, part then of the Danish realm, and later travelled to the Netherlands and to London and to Oxford. He then served as a pastor in Horsby, north of Flensburg, a centre of Lutheran pietism, which emphasised personal transformation through individual devotion and spiritual renewal. Pontoppidan's early reputation as a writer of religious tracts and then as a historian and antiquarian, writing and publishing in Latin and in the expected German, the language of the court, made his reputation, but I'll have to pass over his early writings, fascinating though they are. But note just that in 1735, as chaplain to the notably pious and authoritarian Christian VI, he was commissioned to write an elucidation of the small catechism of Martin Luther in service to the Church of Denmark, which resulted in a book in translation known as Truth to Godliness. It was written in Danish to ensure widespread understanding and compliance. It was a guide in Danish and Norwegian religious thought and practice for the next 200 years, and as I understand it, was compulsory in Norwegian schools until 1961, so for a certain generation, Pontoppidan is a well-known name in Norway. This commentary was printed at the Weissenhuset in Copenhagen, a royal foundation which served as an orphanage for the needy and a hub for like-minded clergy, scholars, and theologians, and to where the former Missionacollege Trykkeri, or printing house, had been moved after the city fire of 1728 and given its own printing privilege, including exclusively from 1740 to print and distribute Bibles and hymnals. The Missionaries-Collegiate had also been established to fund and direct Protestant missions under royal patronage, including in the Danish colony of Fort Dansberg, Tranquebar, which was to be a notable distant recipient of copies of his history. Notably, these endeavours at the Weissenhuset demonstrated the utility of collaborative information networks, something to be absolutely vital to the construction of the story. The first director of the Weissenhuset was Count Johann Ludwig Holstein, Danish Minister of State, co-founder of the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, and revered dedicatee of Pontoppidan's history. In the Weissenhuset also worked several other prominent pietists, one of whom you can see here, Erik Johan Jensen, who prepared at Holstein's prompting a description of countries belonging to the King of Denmark, based on answers received from a questionnaire, again, about information gathering, which was really important, which in this case was sent out in 1743. And this material was left to Pontoppidan and then to Hans de Hoffmann, lawyer, genealogist, historian, and member of various state councils, and, significantly, the brother of Pontoppidan's third wife, Johann Marie de Hoffmann. Hoffmann was to be instrumental in the printing arrangements for the Historie, and after Pontoppidan's death, oversaw the publication of parts 4 to 6 of Pontoppidan's masterly Danish atlas, in which he was said to be a more thorough researcher than Pontoppidan, and we'll see the atlas later. Pontoppidan's activities increasingly combined the theological with the historical, but again I'll reluctantly pass over these, including his extraordinary novel, Menoza, the eccentric story of an Indian prince who maintained that rationalist arguments for the existence of God are by themselves insufficient for salvation. But suffice to say that in these early 1740s, Pontoppidan was flourishing intellectually and, in the broadest sense, politically. All changed in 1746. The succession of Frederick V brought the rejection of his father Christian VI's famously pious court and a reversionary censure of pietism. Let's see Frederick V again, with his wife, Queen Louise, who was actually the daughter of George II. The new king's criticism of Pontoppidan's sympathies led, it seems, to his dispatch from Copenhagen. Let's have a modern shot of Copenhagen, to be bishop of the northern trading city and port of Bergen. Let's have a little look at Bergen in Pontoppidan's. Here was as a trading city, modern Bergen, with the merchants' houses still standing. Pontoppidan's cathedral is there on the right, the slightly larger church of St. Mary's on the left. And Bergen also features on that vignette, at least on the left one, of the first. Sorry, it's not a great blow-up, but there is Bergen Harbour. This is a little better, actually. One of the pull-outs from the Danish edition of Bergen. It also involved the enforced selling of Pontoppidan's large library in Copenhagen, and his catalogue for that sale, I haven't got a slide of it, unfortunately, I should have taken one. That catalogue still survives. Anyway, arriving in June 1748, Pontoppidan's exceptional energy was evident from the outset. Within months, he conceived the writing of his natural history. It was, he wrote, partly to demonstrate the glory of God, that the glory of God begat the rationally and physically revealed marvels of his creation, and partly as a result of his explorations of his new diocese and country that increased these discoveries in natural history, a subject which in the rest of Europe and the Americas was spawning huge intellectual and publishing interest. Early 18th century pietism fueled complex and bitter religious skirmishes, including within its own varied ranks. But to this tumult also came an oplysning, which might be interpreted as enlightenment, but also translates as information, disclosure, and awareness. Verifiability underpinned this oplysning, but as recent scholarship on natural history of the period has also insisted, credulity was also integral to its methods. Essential to Pontoppidan's planned work was this process of collecting materials, a process enabled by his annual visitation tours in the limited travelling season of the 3 summer months, and the development of a clerical network of informants. Pontoppidan's letterbook of 1751 to 53, which still survives in Bergen, contains numerous references to information requested and received, and he even offered plaudits to his helper in the Historie itself, writing somewhat patronizingly of the benefits of natural history collection for priests stranded in country parishes, as you can read. Pontoppidan expected high standards and responsiveness, but according to numerous reports, he was well liked by ordinary people, even though he spoke to them in a High Danish, as increasingly standardized by contemporary print, including his own. At the same time, Pontoppidan corresponded with natural history writers and collectors overseas, including the Welsh naturalist and antiquarian Thomas Pennant, to whom he was also to send mineral and fossil samples. Actually, I quite like that one just because of the cover of it. That's the second letter. He's currently held at Warwick County Record Office. In June 1749, after months of collecting materials, Pontoppidan began writing, and the dramatically entitled First Attempt became a detailed survey of the flora, fauna, and topography of Norway, with sections also on habits, costume, and folklore. Completion of his writing was interrupted by a great fire in Bergen. Excuse me. In Bergen in August 1751, an interruption which shocked him. He wrote into speedier writing and to publish the work in 2 parts, 1 year apart. And in writing in the vernacular, Pontoppidan contributed to a growing number of writers, and most notably the interestingly Bergen-born dramatist, essayist, and historian Ludvig Holberg, in working in and standardizing the vernacular. At this point, one of Pontoppidan's most notable correspondents was the clergyman, natural historian, and topographer Hans Strom, who's even afforded a modern Norwegian stamp, as you can see there. Strom became the first Norwegian to give species description for Norwegian animals, and in 1760, he co-founded the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences and Letters. Pontoppidan also used Strom's sons for information gathering. They lived, he noted, among fishermen. And perhaps now indeed, I should introduce what I've been holding back. Sea monsters. Here is the famous image. Pontoppidan was determinedly scientific. He sought exacting confirmations and verifications, especially as he wished to be absolutely secure in this glorification of the Almighty. But in the 8th chapter of part 2 of the Historie, Pontoppidan provides, as well as these famous images, a series of in-court written statements. I've got one here. They're beautifully set out. Really, really great care is set in these. They go over several pages, many pages, in fact. Testimonies verifying sightings of sea snakes, other sea monsters, mermen and mermaids, some of them Danish-speaking. Depositions reproduced include those from Strom, many ministers and ferrymen, and most notably, and to be much cited in the next centuries, a 1746 Bergen sworn testimony, and you can see it here actually if you look on the left-hand side at the bottom, the sworn testimony of one Captain Lawrence Ferry, whose account of sighting the great sea snakes is given in impressive detail. And it's followed by numerous the names of signed testators. As in some other parts of history, Pontoppidan's credulity is on show, if not on trial. For example, he writes that Norwegians often live to be 120. But undaunted, he advised his readers in his original Danish preface to part 2. There's the full paragraph, actually translated from the Danish. There's a difference as it appeared in the English, which is interesting. I haven't got time to go into these nuances of translation, which itself is absolutely fascinating. But he says here, to quote, "He will be accused of a previously announced gullibility in these matters, and I will have to endure it for so long before the reader has read through the chapter. But then I will not need an apology." That's the nuanced one, actually, from as it appears in the English edition. "Ultimately," implores Pontoppidan, "if the Lord our Creator is great even in the smallest things, I believe that he can also be known even greater in the greatest things, and consequently reports of news of these large sea animals cannot displease him at all." Importantly, Strom had provided Pontoppidan with the sea serpent drawings. From the outset, Pontoppidan envisaged his history to be illustrated for reference, even though this increased the complexity of the publication process. Pontoppidan's title page here announced the work as illuminated by copperplates. And again, we have another further instance of upplysning, of enlightenment by copperplate. None of the original plates or copied ones are signed, however, so we know almost nothing of the artists involved or of the engravers in Copenhagen or indeed later in London. Only the title page vignette to the first Copenhagen, there are, again, the recuts, sorry, that's the Danish and the German. German is at the top, Danish is at the bottom. They were recut again in London. Only the title page vignette to the first Copenhagen volume is signed by its engraver, Odvard Helmut de Loder, and its artist, who's here, Peter Kramer, shown there on the right. The image, as already seen, is of Bergen harbour and boats, foregrounded by a deity who has been identified by some as Apollo, but is perhaps Amphitrite, goddess of the sea, and whose offspring, incidentally, included sea monsters. But going back to the key illustration, Strom's drawing of the sea worm is notably derivative, being close to long-standing representations circulated over several centuries. One image dominated. A lengthy book of 1555 by Aulus Magnus, much translated, here's the side cover, here's the cover, and known in English as a description of the northern peoples, became the standard reference on Scandinavia. Like Albertus Magnus in the 13th century, and with reference to ancient Nordic myth, Aulus Magnus described, you can hear, a whole menagerie of exotic sea creatures. Here is a giant seahorse with bifurcated fish tails, and there is a swamfish, monstrous and ravenous animal in the sea, and above all, a colossal sea serpent that specifically prowled beyond the rocky coastline of Bergen. Among notable readers of Aulus Magnus, Conrad Gesner, the Swiss physician, naturalist, and bibliographer, repeated the descriptions and had redrawn the alarming illustrations of two species of sea serpent, a smaller serpent up to 40 feet long, and the dragon-like megaserpents. These were abiding imaginaries. You can see them there in the original. Abiding imaginaries, I would suggest, for Pontoppidan, for his parish priests, and his testifying seafarers. But let's resume the publication history a little. And I'll have to cut much out because I want to discuss reception in a moment. But let's tell you a little bit about the printing. The manuscript of the first part of Volume 1, that's the one at the top there, top left-hand corner, was sent to Copenhagen in June 1751. That Pontoppidan sent this first volume in parts is notable. A notable risk in terms of transport and delivery, but surely also complicating the process at Ludolf Henrik Lilly's printing house, in Copenhagen, where it was overseen by Pontoppidan's brother-in-law, the assessor Hans de Hoffmann, whom we saw earlier. Given Pontoppidan's continuing episcopal position, no further official license to print seems to have been thought necessary. But the production took between about 9 months and a year, a length of time that I think can only be explained by the engraving and separate printing and then collation of the images. Here in the Weissenhus. Pontoppidan's two separate prefaces actually comment on the printing stage, together with elaborate prefatory dedications and verses. Again, I'm going to skip over them, except to note that much of the support was impressive, but disingenuous. Quite apart from the overwrought dedicatory flattery of Holstein, see there on the left, and Adam Gottlob Moltke, tutor and favourite of Frederick V. The supportive introductory paean to the volume was penned by Ole Tidemand, Pontoppidan's eventual successor as Bishop of Bergen, and a plotter against him. Again, the great Danish book collector, Ole Wilhelm Luxdorf, most of whose 15,000 volumes are now in the Royal Danish Library, penned a laudatory poem, but, and it anticipates what I'm going to say about reception and legacy, there's the poem, he wrote withering notes on the front page of his own copy, which is now held in Oslo. That's the front page of Luxdorf's copy of the history. He quotes the Comte de Buffon's 1777 Histoire naturelle, and I translate for you here, "I doubt very much that hares eat mice, and that's not the only marvellous or false fact which can be blamed on Pontoppidan." And then he adds in Latin, "See the same testimony, or false testimony, in other places also." And so to translation. In his preface to part 2 of the Historie, Pontoppidan adds hopes that translation of his work in time will usefully reveal unusual things for different nations as well as for ourselves. And interestingly, he links translation specifically to the section on the sea monsters, cited here actually from the English edition. The translation into German began a few months after the appearance of the first volume of the history in the summer of 1752. The translator, Johann Adolf Scheibe, was a German-Danish composer who kept himself afloat by translating. Like Pontoppidan, he'd fallen foul of the new court of Frederick V, and now taught in faraway Sonderburg in southern Denmark. The translation seems to have been commissioned by its Copenhagen printer and publisher, Franz Christian Mummer, who also inserted in the German edition a dedication to the Queen we saw earlier, Queen Louise, the Hanoverian English daughter of George II. The dedication read, "Righteous mother of the country, given to us by heaven, who is alone able to do my business and to provide this book with a wonderful sweetness." It was for good reason, perhaps, that Scheibe was fully acknowledged, as you see there, in the title page of the translation. In his 16-page foreword to the first part, dated 15th of April, 1753, Scheibe offered an extended commentary on the work, and he detailed problems, many problems, including translating obscure terms. One of the interesting things about this is actually the extent to which Pontoppidan was inventing new terms and inventing language, in taking things from the Norwegian dialect at the time. And in his preface, Scheibe complained that he had to rush, interestingly, because the bookseller wanted it to be ready for the Ostermesse, the Easter fair, probably the trade fair at Leipzig. In his 17-page preface to the second volume, Scheibe is stridently defensive of his work on the first volume because it had been savaged by critics, including a lengthy critical review in Staats- und Gelehrte Zeitung in August 1753, and believes frequent misprints occurred because of what he calls his embarrassingly poor handwriting, and for that reason announced that a list of corrections to the first part would follow the contents list in the second volume. I find it fascinating that these prefaces should give such detail about the translation process and about his excuses for what went wrong. Fascinatingly, this translator's preface, have we got it here? No, we haven't. I'll leave that for a moment. This translator's preface to the second volume, with all its extraneous material and tedious length, is now a very rare item. It has been removed from most of the surviving copies that I've seen. And even rarer is that errata list that he promised for the second volume, which, if it were ever fully inserted or ever fully printed by Mummer, seems now only to survive in one fragment, this fragment of 2 pages, left at the end of one copy and crossed through with these long pen strokes. I know, that's extraordinary. Okay, moving to the London edition. Reviews and commentaries about both editions of the story circulated rapidly, and the English edition was published in February 1755. This takes us back to Pennant in Wales, whom Pontoppidan was to count as one of his fossil friends, as he calls them. Here is Pontoppidan's first letter to Pennant of the 7th of September, 1755. Pontoppidan writes in French, and I translate, "Although I spent half a year in your fine homeland, I dare not yet undertake a reply in English to your very obliging letter of the 18th of July past." And then a further key sentence. "Regarding the matter in question, I'm very glad, even blessed, to see my feeble essay on the natural history of this country translated into your language, just as it is in German, and now in French. It's really too great an honour for me." Now, quite apart from this mention of a translation in French, of which there appears to be no surviving evidence whatsoever, this seems to be a thank you from Pontoppidan to Pennant for sending him the first copy of the English edition, which had been first advertised for subscription in December of the previous year. Now, there is some interesting, and I think that's the right interpretation. It all turns on that phrase, 18e de juillet passé, but I think 7 weeks before just gives enough time for that, and I think that is what we see here. It's the arrival of this first copy. I do wish Pontoppidan had actually spelt it out and said thank you for the book, but he doesn't. Germane to these timings is that the financing arrangements for the London edition, contrasted with the arrangements in Copenhagen. Pontoppidan seems to have engineered some financial support for his original 2 volumes, writing also to Holstein that the drawings for this I would probably strive to procure at my own expense, but he also requested funding for the engraving of the copperplates and for the printing expenses. After Pontoppidan's death in 1764, the bookseller Andreas Hartvig Godici issued an auction catalogue of the late bishop's books and effects. In this catalogue, the original copperplates, the Pladden, were listed under the book's Danish titles as in 32 items, presumably therefore including the title page vignettes that we saw. Listed also in the auction catalogue was a bundle of loose pages of the printed engravings themselves. Pontoppidan had retained both plates and the superfluous engraved pages as his property, and that doesn't assist, alas, in determining the extent of his original patronage, but we must assume that Lilly also sold copies, even though some were distributed as gifts. Notably also, Godic's auction catalogue includes for sale, under the listed remainder or remaining copies, you see the remaining, the 85 copies here, and plus 17, mention that in a moment, what I've highlighted with the arrow here translates as the publisher's rights to the same book. Rather wonderfully, we have a portrait of Godici, and you see in the books ahead of him and with rights includes one for Pontoppidan's Danish atlas. Although again we have no printing records to confirm this, the German language edition undertaken by the successful bookseller Mumme must have been conceived as a commercial affair, complete with its extravagant new dedication to the Queen. Now, by contrast, the London edition was originally financed on a subscription basis, with proposals for printing first advertised by Andreas Linde on the 1st of October 1754. This is going to be I do apologize for this poor slide taken from the internet of the newspaper, but the conditions which are announced here in the public advertiser for 1st of October 1754 was that the folio work would be printed in a new letter, on good paper, and will contain, each copy, as near as can be computed, about 100 sheets, of the same size as the specimen. Specimen was offered. Printed 1 guinea in sheets, one half to be paid at the time of subscribing, and the other half on the delivery of the book in February next. Linde would take in subscriptions, but so also would a large group of others, including O'Innes and Richardson, Miller and Norse in the Strand, we'll go there in a minute, and Dodsley and others in London, and T. Merrill in Cambridge, and J. Fletcher in Oxford. No subscriber list was ever made public, though, and 2 years later, the Natural History is advertised at the end of another Linde book as for sale as books lately published by Linde in 1-volume folio at £1, 10 shillings bound. Subscription copies were disposed of, and the book was now sold outright. Now, the German bookseller Andreas Linde, who commissioned the translation into English, was originally from Saxony and an active member of the German and Scandinavian community in London, centred in the Strand and around the respective Lutheran churches. You see a map here. The orange is Norse's shop from about his career was from 1730 to 1780, but that's really from the latter 20, 30 years of his career, the shop there. And behind in yellow is Andreas Linde's main shop. He started a little bit before then, as you see, where the white letter is in St. Catherine Street. But the point really is that it was a densely inhabited, expanding area, populated especially by European immigrant traders and notable and well-established booksellers. A 1750s trade card describes Linde, who had arrived in London by January 1743, as bookseller, bookbinder and stationer at the Bible in Catherine Street in the Strand. Several of his bindings for George III when Prince of Wales survive in the King's Library at the British Library and include a very large folio copy of Pontoppidan's Natural History. There's the ordinary folio on the left, there's the King's copy on the right. Just to show you, I think I've got another one open. Measures just over 16 inches by nearly 10 inches within medium folio measurements as compared to the other standard folio of 12 inches by 9 inches. Another such large folio is also held at the Royal Library at Windsor. And what I find fascinating about this is when you look at it online to see their collection, you see the page that they've chosen to photograph it as open. But going back, Linda had also developed an affinity with Nordic concerns, possibly during a visit to Germany in the spring of 1755, which might well have included Hamburg and the Danish-ruled Altona district and the Leipzig trade fair itself. The first indication of his interest in Scandinavian subjects seems to be the English and Danish discovery by Andreas dictionary, English and Danish dictionary by Andreas Bertelsen, a Norwegian-born, London-based clergyman, which Johan Haberkorn had printed for Linda in 1754. You can see there the dedication to the Crown Prince of Denmark, followed by a list of subscribers, the vast majority of whom, and it goes on for several pages, are in Norway or in some ways associated with Norway. Bertelsen was therefore an obvious choice to translate Pontoppidan, which he naturally did from the Danish rather than the German, and as was made clear on the London title page, at least the translation itself. But unlike Scheiber in the German Copenhagen edition, Bertelsen himself was not to be acknowledged on the title page, or indeed anywhere within. On the orders of Linda, the English text was printed in folio by John Reeves of Drury Lane. And Reeves, who had been used by Linda before, is also not acknowledged in the book, but can be identified from the typeface, ornaments, and design. The English edition, shorn of the additional German translators' rather eccentric commentaries, also discarded the elaborate dedications and prefatory verses of the Danish edition. And there was this one other notable omission, the title words of First Attempt. The English title page stood with greater, plainer authority as the natural history of Norway. The typographical work, I would suggest, of Reeves underscored this authority. For the first time, the two parts were printed simultaneously and bound as one volume, and the foundational type, the new letter, was a great Prima Roman, not Kasdan, I think, but quite possibly a Dutch import. Here's the introduction. It's a type, when well printed, of lucidity and elegant ligatures, ascenders and descenders. And it offers a spatially attractive composition. Italics are used sparingly for certain citations, headings, titles, and works of emphasis. Smaller Roman is used for footnotes, with some Greek and other types used appropriately in the references. And for headings and marginal reference tags as well, this is very important. All is in marked contrast with the typographical complexity of the original Danish and the German language edition. Rare, of course, would have been the opportunity for a reader to compare different language editions. Actually, Joseph Banks is a rare exception. He held all three. But the greater elegance, simplicity, use and space and readability of the English typography was consequential. Such printing supported a translation that was finally executed, and with the addition of headings and other apparatus to aid this work as a volume of reference. You see there, actually interesting, this also shows you the page to guide the binder in placing the, or not, as we might see in a moment, placing the images, but also a splendid index of 11 double-columned and well-presented pages. The further translation concerned the engraved plates, which were not shared between the printers of the Danish and German language editions, as I think I've shown, were actually recut in Copenhagen, and in London copied and recut again, usually with astonishing exactitude. Let's move off for a moment from the sea monster and show you a comparison between the London edition on the left and the German on the right. The new engravings match the size of the Danish ones, but given the folio format, they were displayed with an elegant amount of space around them on the page. And before the title page was inserted the engraved folding map of Norway that was, as acknowledged in the title cartouche, a derivation from Johann Baptist Hoffmann's Grand Atlas of all the world, published in 1716. Now, having examined so many copies, now this is where copies were, that we know that they were up to 1800 in Great Britain and Ireland, and then additional ones up to about 2000, as far as we can tell. There will be others, of course, in private collections. And here we can see copies around the world, again up to 1820 as recorded, including Tranquebar in Denmark, and also in the eastern seaboard. And here we are today, where copies are known to exist. There are many more in Europe. That's only a certain, they just overlap each other. But I do have, given that having examined so many of the surviving copies, I do have one qualification to my argument about the greater influence of Pontoppidan's labours, and that is the variation in quality both intentional and otherwise, between different copies. This is also, just to acknowledge colleagues' help here, this is collections from Poland, from Poznan and Wrocław. Paper quality varies in the surviving copies of the first Danish edition, and although the paper used is often poor, some of the finer copies benefit from sturdier materials. If you recall the slide a few moments ago, the post-mortem catalogue of Pontoppidan's effects listed as remaining stock 85 ordinary copies of the second volume, but with 17 copies on writing paper. You can see this in the surviving copies. This is one on writing paper. There's a comparison for you with writing paper at the top. It's rather poor preservation, but and with the ordinary paper at the bottom. And again, you can see again the comparison between the two. And in London, of course, as those original proposals for subscription made clear, Linda's splendid folio London edition was offered in 2 different paper qualities. A few copies will be printed on fine writing demi. The origins of most of the ordinary and the finer paper across the editions is unclear, but at least in the standard version of the English edition, the chain lines are turned, that is, chain lines on otherwise unwatermarked laid paper, that are transverse or horizontal rather than vertical, as might be expected in a folio. This points to paper made by double moulds, and, at least at this date, most likely to be Dutch. The paper used for the engravings was English, and as you go, there's a poor quality again, and as you can see the English watermark there in the folio. The few English copies printed on finer paper were advertised as including hand coloration to the folded map of Norway. But again, it's very confusing here because some of the finer copies have the poorer map and some of the poorer copies have the finer map. And the impressions are sometimes also very poor. Early in part 1, in the Joseph Banks fine copy, for example, allegedly fine copy, you can see that successive pages carry reverse ink impressions from other pages. This isn't ink showing through from the other side. It must have been laid when the paper was drying and laid on top of other pages, stacked too soon and still damp. And despite the excellence of design and composition, some copies were very poorly printed by Reeves and were notably imperfect. There are notably imperfect examples in the University Library of St Andrews and in the Advocates' Library of Edinburgh, now held in the National Library of Scotland. Under the Copyright Act of 1709, both the St Andrews and the Advocates' Library were entitled to claim a copy of any book registered at Stationers' Hall. Significantly, both libraries appear to have been sent substandard copies with variable quality of impression, and several of the engravings printed or inserted irregularly. The suggestion, I think, is that Linda unloaded unsellable copies of inferior quality to those libraries requesting gratis volumes under the 1709 Act. More generally, among the 50 or so surviving copies of the English natural history so far examined, the most obvious variations result from inattention to the placement of the engravings. Although most images of the sea worm, for example, are bound in opposite to the text, at least one copy here you have is bound in so that the page is back to front. The page facing the description of the sea worm is entirely blank. Extraordinarily, this is the case with the engraving in the copy printed on expensive fine paper and bought by book connoisseur Thomas Grenville. Several other copies, such as that currently in the keeping of the Royal Society, have the image tipped in facing outwards rather than inwards, so that we have to turn the book to the right to see the sea worm and the ship the right way up. And I could give many, many other examples of this variation in quality. It just fascinates me that this should be so. But I now want to consider reception, contemporary criticism, and later use, much obvious in the many examples that I've seen. In addition to the translations, many anthologies in German, and especially in English, also extracted parts of the history. And new images were also introduced. Here's one of my favourites of the new images. It's called A Dangerous Road in Norway. And this is signed. It's signed by John Lodge, a well-known London engraver who flourished from about 1754 to 1796. And numerous references to Pontoppidan appeared in popular essays, travel books, natural histories, and even novels, including Thomas Amory's Life of John Buncle, published a year after the Natural History, and later in Lawrence Sterne's The Quran. And there were many other anthologies and extracts, including compendiums of modern travels by John Scott in 1763, another one in 1764 by John Payne, William Bathoe in 1767. And there was similar mining in Germany. In 1764, the 20th volume of this Sammlung carried extensive extracts from the history. And although I haven't got time to detail this here, we can also trace first how the natural history subsequently appeared in numerous booksellers' sales catalogues of their own stock and of libraries bought to sell on. And second, how penciled prices in numerous surviving copies give some further market snapshots, although the dating can't really be precise. And despite variations in qualities, it was largely the elegant English edition that ensured the lasting and global influence of Pontoppidan's natural history. Critics and readers applauded the ostensible reliability of the English edition, an authority testified by scrupulous translation, it was said, and typographical performance. A list of 5 errata only appeared at the end of the volume, and this was not only a very modest list, and you can see the 25 errata listed in the German language edition, and with many more identified actually by critics. One of the 5 errors listed in the English edition is the result of Bertelsen or a press reader noticing problems with the meaning of kraken, which is to be corrected to sea snake on the page opposite to the engraving of the sea worm or sea serpent. It's a confusion central to the legacy of the image, as we'll see in a moment, but many owners have dutifully corrected the error by pen in surviving copies. Here's just 2 of them. I think I've found about 10 so far where the correction is made. The further demonstration of the influence of the natural history is simply the rapidity and extensiveness of the travel, not just in Britain and Europe, but around the world. The English edition of the natural history was bought by dozens of institutions and significant writers and collectors around the globe. Here is the order book of the Codrington, All Souls, and here, I like this one too very much, is the copy bought by Benjamin Franklin for his newly founded library company of Philadelphia, acquisition number 102. Another purchaser was the Raja of Tangor, the Danish Indian colony. Just a little too late to be an original subscriber, but an enthusiastic collector. Even though the colony attracted numerous Danish and German pietist missionaries, it's the English edition that was bought. Many surviving copies bear the book plates of numerous naturalists, scholars, and interested gentlemen, including John Cater, the English timberman. Oh, there's the library in Tangor. Including John Cater, the English timber merchant and MP, and Thomas Grenville MP, son of the Prime Minister and bibliophile who left his collection to the British Museum. And here I was really pleased to identify this one, which is now back in Oslo. It's the copy bought by Edward Gibbon in Lausanne. It's now in Oslo because it's part of the collection, as you might see there, of the other bookplate of the former director of Guinness and Mahon, who married a Norwegian and was later honoured for his wartime work in the Special Boat Service in Norway. And it's the marginal comments, other annotations, and pasted-in notes by readers in surviving copies, which attest most vividly, here's a bit more scribble, which attest most vividly to engagement with a section on sea snakes. And it's that section that receives most attention in surviving copies. One of my favourites, and again this is a copy now back at Bergen, but once owned by an amateur naturalist and former mayor of Margate, a Mr. Arthur Rocco, who proudly signs it when he bought it in 1910, but who also faithfully notes on the flyleaf, chapter on the serpent kraken, read February 1914. There are also many written insertions attesting to sightings of the monster. Glued in close to the kraken description in the copy owned by Joseph Banks and now held at the British Library is a 4-page letter of a recent monster sighting intended, you may just work it out and make it at the top there, intended for the printer of the St. James Chronicle, together with I don't know whether it was ever printed in the St. James Chronicle, we haven't yet found an extant copy at the right date, together with a further 2 letters, one of 2 pages of a sighting of a great sea monster off Rothsay in August 1775, and one of 5 pages, all in this book, further recounting the sighting, another sighting and sent to the Sheriff of Lanark. Another signed deposition dated 1786 of the sighting of a giant sea worm off the Isle of May is inscribed on the rear paste down of the copy of the natural history that I talked about earlier in the Advocates' Library of Edinburgh. And sightings are, of course, not only noted in the English edition. A Danish edition held at the National Library in Oslo bears, if you just look at that on the bottom left-hand side, marginal notes against the Serpens Marinus. The notes are dated 1868, and they're made by Ludvig Dahr, Norwegian jurist, landowner, and politician, referencing sightings recorded in 1837 and 1839 in the daily weekday Oslo newspaper, Morgenbladet. Long, intense sightings, themselves referencing back to Pontoppidan and mirroring the famous image with the rowboat. And we can translate, I'll just leave it up on the slide for you, about the terrible guest that these boatmen, these entirely trustworthy witnesses, had met at sea. And so finally, the legacy. Comparisons between the differently formatted, printed, illustrated, and translated and anthologized editions of the work can thus be made in many ways, all energizing the debate, as Pontoppidan himself anticipated. This proved the most toxic aspect of this history of writing, production, circulation, and reception. An anonymous critic in the Retrospective Review, an English periodical published between 1820 and 1828, wrote that Pontoppidan, though idolized in Norway, has been universally hailed and quoted by the rest of the world as the Munchausen of his day, and a very wholesale dealer in gratuitous and absolute falsehood. Well, if this was so, there were many that were not listening. The influence of Pontoppidan's celebrated sections in his chapter concerning certain sea monsters or strange and uncommon sea animals was extraordinary. His affirmation of giant sea creatures as part of God's creation depended on the explicit presentation within his work of testimonials and verified sightings, all as contributions to an increasingly popular exploration of natural science. The extended descriptions and depictions of the giant sea worms or serpents afforded models and encouragement to subsequent recorded sightings the world over, from appearances, both monsters and Pontoppidan references, off the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, Newfoundland, South Africa, Argentina, India, the coasts of Malay. You can find all these in the newspapers, surviving newspapers, to the spectral depths of Loch Ness, and to numerous literary and pictorial references. In 1851, for example, Herman Melville described the arrival of a giant squid in a dramatic passage in Moby Dick with these words: "There seems some ground to imagine that the great kraken of Bishop Pontoppidan," so Melville expected his audience to recognize Pontoppidan may ultimately resolve itself into a squid. The manner in which the bishop describes it as ultimately rising and sinking with some other particulars he narrates. In all of this, the two correspond, but much abatement is necessary with respect to the incredible bulk that he assigns it. In 1869 to 70, Professor Pierre Aronnax, fictional natural scientist and narrator of Jules Verne, 20 milieux sous la mer, said that, I'll read the English, Pontoppidan, another bishop, Pontoppidan of Bergen, also tells of a devilfish so large a whole cavalry regiment could maneuver on it. Reference books of the late 19th century, such as Henry Lee's Sea Monsters Unmasked, also use Pontoppidan. As Lee wrote of one sighting, there was no appearance of a mane. Its mode of progressing was by vertical undulation. This is the mane, of course, going back to those drawings of the horse and the worm. And 5 witnesses described it as having the hunched protuberances mentioned by Captain de Ferry, as noted, the main witness of Pontoppidan. And many other modern newspaper accounts also claim Pontoppidan as a source. Here's one from the late 19th century, as you can see, although I'm going to move on to, I think, probably my favorite one, of the Mayo News of February 2000. Here it is. And you can see here, he says, "I'm not sure when the natural history of Norway was written." He only had to Google it, but never mind. Except that it was certainly over 100 years ago. The naturalists who lived back then depended largely on hearsay for their information, etc. Such widespread and long-lasting influence is explained, I think, in part by the appeal of natural scientific discoveries and of the evidence for their authentication, and in part by the residual myth of Nordic monsters and maritime behemoths. Both inspirations, the natural and the fabulous, were integrated in word and image in the notorious sections in the history, and then further conveyed by translation and by its convincing and authoritative material conveyance. Reception was based on both the ideas in the text and their resonance with existing cultural freight, and the form of the text itself in translation, but also in presentation, by publication, prefatory and dedicatory explanations, which varied between language editions, material quality, and promotion and reviewing. So, conceptually, is all this a book biography or the life cycle of a book? I think neither. It is not a book biography because it is not about one book, one originating text, yes, in this case a Danish text, but as translated, transformed linguistically, materially, and visually. The result, perhaps, is more one of book biographies, in the sense of being a collective biography, the history of hundreds or at least many dozens surviving copies, individual copies. And none of these really conforming to a life cycle either, because each history has a more linear, sequential, and for some copies, a continuing and open-ending and still evolving existence. It is perhaps then better to attempt a different type of analogy that also conceives of the book as having a life. A book biology, perhaps, rather than a biography, whereby in this study of a life, a book is conceived by its intellectual creator with very specific intentions, and is then transmuted by other actors or agencies into these different material, visual, and linguistic forms. In this case, the 3 editions, Danish, German, and English, all also materially different, but then each of these reproduced in 3 separate, one-off operations of printing, collation, and then slightly more dispersed, I admit, binding, to pursue thereafter their own lives. No more reproduction, no book genealogy, but hugely diverse and differently influential lives. Some terminated in relative infancy, some poor in health and quality, some moving around the world and through many hands, some mutilated, others static, preserved in situ and totemically treated. The biosphere becomes the bibliosphere, and one where other models of book biology might exist, where a book, for example, might be revived from near death and translated in different ways at many years' remove from the birth period, for example, or where a greater hybridity, bibliographically or in cross-cultural terms, might spawn different forms, functions, and ecologies. Well, just simply to close on a lighter note, even cinematic creatures in such films as It Came From Beneath the Sea, 1955, Behemoth the Sea Monster, 1959, and Gorgo, 1961, many of them encroaching upon London, as you will see, bear uncanny resemblance to the drawings of sea monsters in the history.
Excellent. Well, so the Loch Ness Monster does survive, or does exist, just what we all wanted to know. So thank you for that conclusion, James. But no, very much more seriously, though, that was a really wonderful exposition and an introduction to book biography, book biology, the ecology of the book. You know, all of those terms are very relevant to all of our work, and it was very interesting to hear that, so thank you.